Hey, welcome to our YouTube channel, the Mudline Church of the Nazarene, and our journey through the New Testament, and this is episode 25. And at this point, we're starting to get to those latter books of the New Testament, some of the smaller ones. We only have a few weeks of this left. And so today I want to tackle 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. Commonly part of the pastoral epistles, and they're called that because in these letters, the author, traditionally, which is Paul, is writing to his younger associates, Timothy, and then there's a third one, Titus. The difference between Timothy and Titus is that Timothy was Jewish. He had a Jewish mother, and Titus was Gentile. Now, let me just explain the role these two played in the early church. There was an issue, and the issue early on was circumcision. All Jewish men were required to be circumcised. And now when Paul went out on his missionary activities and started to go out into the churches, and people responded to his message and started following Jesus Christ, some of the people who had been there from the beginning wanted to make the requirement that all these new believers also had to be circumcised as an adult. Now, it seems that Paul asked Timothy to go ahead with this procedure because Timothy was Jewish. But Paul was adamant that Titus not have to go through this. In order to force Titus to do the Jewish ritual, in essence would be saying that you had to be Jewish in order to follow Jesus Christ. And Paul desperately wanted to avoid that outcome. So that just leads us to 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. If we get into the books, they're largely practical advice for someone who is responsible for a church. We see a lot of warnings in 1 Timothy about how to hand out benevolence, about how to handle a church, about avoiding the love of money, about the importance of sound doctrine. It's pretty standard stuff. 2 Timothy is much more personal. 2 Timothy is seemingly a very personal letter of someone in their last days of life. Now here's the question we have when we get to 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. The question that we still battle today is who wrote these two books. As I said before, traditionally we've ascribed Paul as the author to 1 and 2 Timothy, but starting about 150, 200 years ago, the authorship of Paul has come into question. And there's a lot of good reasons for this. If you open up 1 Timothy, the language and the vocabulary and the style sounds completely different than Paul's other letters. Just look at the greeting. Look at the greeting in Romans or Philippians, Ephesians. It's very personal. And then look at the greeting in 1 Timothy. The language is different. The style is different. It leads a lot of people to think that Paul did not write it. Also look at the content. The content also might lead us in that direction. You read Galatians where it says, in Christ there's neither male nor female. You have in Philippians and in Romans where Paul commends women as leaders of the church, even calls them fellow apostles. In 1 Corinthians, whatever group came with a letter that Paul had to answer questions from, it was from Chloe. The tone toward women in 1 Timothy is a lot different. There's a command for women to be silent. And it might lead one to believe that this is written maybe in Paul's name a generation or two later. So if you ask the consensus opinion right now, the consensus opinion was that 1 Timothy was written probably as late as 100 AD, somewhere in there, and written by someone else in the name of Paul. Now, in that day, that meant something different. We get bothered by that. We call that plagiarism. But in that day, it was considered an honor to write in the name of a historical person that has influenced you or someone who has made a difference for you. So writing in their name would have been considered honorable. When we get to 2 Timothy, it's a whole different matter altogether. I think 2 Timothy is written by Paul. or at least there is a letter from Paul at the heart of Second Timothy. It just sounds like Paul. The language, the vocabulary, the rhythm, it's all there. I have run the race, I've kept the faith, and now there awaits for me a crown of righteousness. It's just that phrase just sounds like Paul. I'm already being poured out like a drink offering. So I think Second Timothy represents Paul's last thoughts, his last words, kind of a last will and testament as he's awaiting his own execution. Now, it leads to another question. When was Paul executed? We don't know. Now, we do know that Paul is alive at the end of the book of Acts. He is imprisoned. He's taken to Rome. He's under house arrest. And when the book of Acts ends, Paul is just under house arrest in Rome. We have a very strong church tradition that Paul was executed. He was beheaded in Rome. Here's what we don't know. We have two separate church traditions. One is Paul's executed there not too long after the book of Acts, around 62 AD. The other tradition is Paul was released, ended up going to Western Europe, what he calls Spain, and he comes back 4 years later, 5 years later, and on his arrival back in Rome, Paul is executed in 66 or 67 AD. Perhaps the stronger tradition is the second one. There are many churches in the south of Europe, Spain and southern France, that all claim to have their founding by Paul. In fact, there's quite a few of them claim they have Paul's elbow or his finger bone or something in a box somewhere in the church. So it's just a little bit of the history of Paul and where we get to 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy, these books that we battle. So 1 Timothy, I think the majority opinion is Paul did not write it, but someone else a little later. 2 Timothy, I think Paul did write it. 2 Timothy, if it was Paul, it was written sometime in the 60s. 1 Timothy, we don't know. If you think Paul wrote it, it would have been written early. If you don't think, that could have been a book that was written much, much later. Future weeks, we're going to go on through Hebrews, James, 1 John, and Revelation. So we have 4 more parts of the New Testament, kind of as background to go through. Thank you for joining us. Hey, like us, subscribe to the channel, send us a little question or message. We'd love to answer your question. It's good to see you, and we'll see you next week here on our YouTube channel.